Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Ikovenko. It is now 7 hours 43 minutes in Kiev, today, March 16th, and we continue our morning reflection about what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. Well, now, in general, there are quite a few interesting messages. I'll start, perhaps, not by talking about Trump. Otherwise, it really seems like we have nothing else to discuss. Trumpophilia going on. I'll start with another masterpiece of Russian diplomacy. This time, an exceptionally vivid and striking example of traditional Russian-style diplomacy was recently presented to both the city and the entire world. Yuri Ushakov, who serves as the senior foreign policy assistant to the Russian president, I think Yuri Ushakov has actually taken another step in the development of Russian diplomacy. The thing is, the high-ranking diplomatic advisors to the French president, Emmanuel Bon and Bertrand Buchwalter, traveled all the way to Russia specifically to engage in extensive negotiations with Yuri Ushakov. But, as you know, and as they often say in such peculiar cases, these gentlemen certainly seem to know a thing or two about perversions. What the point of all this is, it's unclear, but they came anyway. After all, that's their job. And they mainly wanted to offer France's services, and, in general, the services of the European Union in negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States of America. Ushakov, according to the French themselves, simply reprimanded them using harsh and blunt language. Told them to move along and explained exactly where to go. So, what can I say? This is a new step. I actually think the French are definitely on the right track. If they keep going like this, the Macrons, they'll keep coming back and trying to talk to Russia. That is to say, after a while, they'll simply, so to speak, continue to reach out and engage. You will be greeted in the offices of various Russian representatives by people squatting down, and some characters in traditional tracksuits. With heavy gold chains hanging around their necks and aggressively spitting out sunflower seed husks, they were answering in the exact way people usually do in those rough Russian back alleys in such situations. So, in fact, the persistent desire to negotiate with Russia, as I see it, inevitably leads to the appropriate results. Well, to put it bluntly, they just swore quite vulgarly at the French representatives. I think that after some time, even Macron will be sent off in the same way, and probably all the other Europeans too, after a while. And Trump will be sent off like that as well. Just give it time, give it time. This is Russia. It is constantly rising from its knees, and having risen from its knees, it begins to behave exactly like their original prototype, the infamous Sharikov, who was once accustomed to walking on all fours like a common beast, and then, following a very specific and experimental medical operation, finally stood up on two legs, and, as a direct consequence of this unnatural change, his personality and behavior shifted for the much, much worse in every possible way imaginable. Now, having discussed the masterpieces of Russian diplomacy, let's move on to the masterpieces of the American political landscape. So, exactly what is going on here? Well, first of all, everyone has noted that, and indeed I mentioned that these are those wars. These two wars, the war in the Middle East and the war in Europe, are like communicating vessels. And this is being confirmed literally every day. Because, as the Financial Times reports, Trump is losing interest in negotiations on Ukraine because of the war in Iran, which generally speaking is natural. And in fact, to be honest, the fate of these negotiations in the absence of interest from Trump is, generally speaking, highly questionable. Overall, I don't think that As I have emphasized on numerous occasions already, these negotiations only benefit Putin. So, the fact that a significant crisis has emerged in these negotiations, I think that's not a negative development. In fact, it is likely even a positive outcome. At the same time, the shift. Here, I would make a distinction. Trump losing interest in the negotiations is not a bad thing. But as for the fact that the United States has shifted its focus to the Middle East, that is truly a bad thing. This is because, first and foremost, this situation is directly connected to delays in the delivery of American weaponry to Ukraine, especially, of course, the vital air defense systems. That is a real problem. Well, as we look at the landscape of American politics, it continues to produce new and unexpected masterpieces, particularly in the person of Donald Trump. So, first of all, regarding the major conflict currently unfolding in Europe, Trump made several notable comments in a recent interview with NBC News. In that discussion, he went on to state that the only thing currently preventing a peace agreement from being reached is none other than President Zelensky himself. Let me find the link for you. The direct quote. I am surprised, Donald Trump said, that President Zelensky does not want to make a deal. Tell Zelensky to make a deal because Vladimir Putin is ready to make a deal. It is actually proving to be much more difficult to negotiate with Zelensky. Those are Trump's words. In reality, where exactly did Donald Trump get the sincere idea that Vladimir Putin wants to end the war? Maybe by using the words make a deal, he actually means some newly proposed American diplomatic schemes. That's possible. But if we're talking about ending the war, it's absolutely clear that Zelensky wants to end the war. He just is absolutely not looking for any kind of capitulation. And it's actually Putin who doesn't want to end the war, which is clearly demonstrated by every single minute of his continuous and relentless missile strikes on Ukrainian territory. So these are some kind of complete and total ruins in Trump's head, which are converted into some nonsense that he spouts every day. Regarding the ongoing war in the Middle East, there is also a very interesting point to consider here. Trump recently stated that, quite apparently, Iran wants to make a deal, but the United States is not quite ready for it just yet. Again, how exactly did Trump find out that Iran wants to make a deal when Iran has been categorically refusing to negotiate? As for the United States of America specifically, what is known is that a number of countries, particularly those in the Gulf, have tried to act as mediators. But Iran takes a completely and fundamentally different position, one that categorically and absolutely blocks any negotiations because it says, first of all, that in order for Iran to even consider coming to the negotiating table, all of the ongoing airstrikes must be brought to a complete and immediate stop, and comprehensive financial compensation must be paid for all of the damage and destruction that has been caused. Obviously, no one is going to agree to that. It's about the same as demanding that the United States of America make Islam its state religion. It's that extreme, something like that. And personally demanding that Trump convert to Islam, as if he had accepted Islam with all the consequences that would entail. That is exactly why it remains highly questionable, where Trump got the idea that he intends or truly wants to strike some kind of deal. But this is just one of those ongoing mysteries that every single statement by Trump provokes. So, taking this even one step further, well, it is widely known and recognized that since we have already had quite a significant number of broadcasts following this past Friday in which we have carefully summed up some of the key results, I will repeat once again that Iran has officially named Ukraine as a legitimate military target. So overall, Ukraine's involvement in the war in the Middle East is closely connected to the specific fact that, firstly, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, recently reached out to President Zelensky with a formal proposal to discuss potential strategic cooperation in the field of combating drones. Furthermore, several nations in the Gulf region have already approached Ukraine with an official request for help regarding this matter. New threat. For them, it's the drone attacks. Furthermore, it has been confirmed that Zelensky has already dispatched several groups of military personnel to provide this critical assistance. At the same time, Trump said that he doesn't need any help from Israel because he himself knows better than anyone what drones, and that America has the best drones in the world. Well, also, besides that, Trump has already publicly stated on several occasions that a complete and total victory in this war has been achieved. Iran no longer has any remaining military potential because Iran's entire military potential has now been completely 100% destroyed. Immediately after that, Donald Trump made several statements. To begin with, he demanded that Europe, and not just Europe, but in fact all NATO countries, should dispatch their naval vessels to the strategic area of the Hormuz Strait. Well, if 100% of Iran's military potential has truly been destroyed, then one must ask, who exactly are they planning to fight over there? So, in other words, it seems the current military potential of the United States is somehow not enough to counter Iran's own military potential, even though it has supposedly been destroyed 100%. So, in addition to all of this, the Pentagon explicitly states that the war with Iran will continue for at least another 6 weeks, which is to say, a full month and a half of ongoing conflict. Again, who are the United States planning to fight if Iran's military potential has been destroyed? This is the most powerful army on the planet. They plan to keep fighting for another month and a half to fight against a state whose military potential has been destroyed by 100%. Furthermore, in addition to this, Donald Trump is currently threatening the NATO alliance, saying that incredibly dark times await them if NATO does not join the United States of America in its war against the nation of Iran, whose entire military potential has been completely destroyed by 100%. Trying to fully understand what lies behind these words and how they fit together is entirely unclear. Well, frankly speaking, we won't even try to do that. The main point in this whole complicated story is that Donald Trump doesn't seem to have any concrete plans for how he actually intends to end the ongoing war, because it's quite obvious that he lacks a clear strategy. Ending the war without a ground operation, relying solely on aerial bombardment and pressuring Iran into this very rocky soil is a rather useless endeavor. Iran's resources for resistance are quite substantial. If we talk about the statement Trump made about destroying 100% of the military potential from what is known, yes, indeed, most of Iran's air defense has been destroyed, and a significant part of its missile capability has also been eliminated. This is evident from the overall number of missiles flying toward Israel in particular. There are now far fewer of them by an order of magnitude, much fewer, but drones are still flying. Iran's navy could also be viewed as having been, to a very large and significant extent, completely decimated. But the ground forces, however, still remain. That is, above all, what remains is The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It is essentially serving as the fundamental and primary foundation of the regime's survival, the central and indispensable pillar on which the entire regime hangs. That is to say, if, and I apologize for perhaps not using the most accurate analogy here, but if the Soviet Union was suspended from the hook of Article 6 of the Constitution, meaning the political power of the party apparatus, then the current Iranian regime hangs on this Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, relying on it primarily as the main guarantee of its survival. And it exists, it is there, it has not been destroyed. This serves as the essential foundation of Iran's ground armed forces. Furthermore, this is precisely why the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps remains fully prepared and ready to crush any internal resistance within Iran. Therefore, any local protests and Trump's calls for Iranian citizens to overthrow the regime themselves are simply another deliberate provocation. That is, just like it was back in January. Go, seize administrative buildings, help is already on the way. So it is perfectly clear that these are completely and utterly unrealistic plans. Now, regarding Iran's capabilities and potential in the field of air and missile defense, yes, they have been significantly weakened and have become much weaker, but Iran still retains and possesses these systems. Some kind of arsenal of drones and short-range missiles. Of course, I can't say exactly what this arsenal is, but for now, the unmanned aerial drones are flying, and they are flying both towards Israel and towards the various Gulf countries. And at the very least, judging by the fact that the Gulf countries have turned to Ukraine for help in combating drones, it's clear that this is a problem for them, because when a small surveillance drone that costs, as they say, some say around $50,000, is suddenly shot down by a sophisticated missile that costs about $3 million, or some people even say it costs even less than that. In short, to put it simply, the number of zeros in the cost of attack means is much lower than in the cost of defense means. So it's clear that this is a serious problem. That is to say, as Tigran is now shining a bright spotlight, much like a small penny, all around the entire perimeter of the Middle East. And it is not just the various military bases that are being affected, including those belonging to several European countries. Furthermore, they are also striking at sovereign countries that do not even have any American bases located within their borders. What kind of different scenarios and outcomes are possible? I honestly cannot name even a single highly qualified expert here who has fully described this situation before. The space of these possible scenarios in sufficient detail. Because one of these potential scenarios, from my point of view, is the possibility that Donald Trump at some point, either due to the current state of his mind and his soul, because of the political pressure in the United States of America, or simply because he eventually gets tired of it all, will just decide to walk away from everything. He will ultimately withdraw from this ongoing war. Exactly as it happened during the 12-day war in the summer of this past year. If we still consider at least the main scenarios, even if only approximately, then there are absolutely realistic ones in my view, for example, a successful internal revolution. It is clearly evident that within this specific context, the IRGC is fully capable of bringing a bloody end to the situation. For this specific scenario. The second option is providing support, primarily for the ethnic minorities living within Iran, in order to replace a ground operation with this alternative. Mainly, we are talking about the Kurdish people. We've already discussed this. In conversations with guests and on the morning stream, we've talked about the fact that the problem is that the Kurds do not trust the United States of America. The US has betrayed the Kurds on numerous occasions throughout history. They were heavily used during the fight in Syria against the Assad regime. Following the conclusion of those operations, the US betrayed the Kurds once again. The problem is that the majority of Kurds live on the territory of Turkey. Naturally, any attempt to support the Kurds, to arm them, to promise them the creation of some kind of autonomy runs into the fierce resistance coming from Turkey, and in addition to that, the growing expectation of betrayal from the United States and a deep-seated lack of trust. All of this significantly undermines the foundations, this particular option, so to speak, as there are several different options available. For example, so to speak, they could consider the option of internal division, or perhaps a strategic attempt to form some kind of formal governing coalition deep within the current ruling regime. Mainly, we are talking about trying to find specific people within the army who are in rather complicated relationships. Syrski, that is to say, subordinates in direct relation to Syrski. Sorry for the repeated tautology. Well, it's very hard for me to judge here, but in any case, so far we don't know of any movement in this direction. Surely, I'm certain that Israeli intelligence is conducting some negotiations with the generals, and the CIA is also working on this. I have no doubt about that, but so far, apparently, these intelligence agents still haven't managed to gather a critical mass of support within the regime. They haven't been able to achieve that. Well, so far there's no sign of it. At this point, there's still nothing visible in that direction. Well, of course, it is certainly true that you can keep pounding Iran into the ground, so to speak, with repeated strikes, but it is increasingly clear that without a large-scale ground operation, absolutely nothing will ever come of it. So, if I were to share my personal impression with you, perhaps the most likely scenario that we might witness is that at some point, Trump will leave Iran, leaving the job practically unfinished. I sincerely hope that I'm wrong about this. By the way, it's quite possible, actually,